So, when you think about an iconic World War II aircraft, the first aircraft that comes to mind is not the P-36. But that's what we're talking about today. So, the P-36 was produced by Curtiss, which is a company that most people probably don't know off the top of their heads, but they also went on to make several aircraft that are a little more highly known in public knowledge. Those being the SB-2C Helldiver, the P-40 Warhawk, and a few others here and there. Now, the P-36 itself was not particularly highly used by the United States during World War II itself. It was originally designed and flown around 1935 and was introduced in the United States Army Flying Corps just shortly before the beginning of World War II at 1938. Now, unfortunately, the United States didn't end up actually joining World War II until December 7, 1941, when, of course, Pearl Harbor was bombed. So, the P-36 was not hugely used because it had been replaced by the P-40 before then. But, fear not, the United States is not the only country to use the aircraft that the United States created. See, only about 215 of these were produced for the United States itself. However, 900 were produced as Hawk 75s, it's the same aircraft, just a different name, for export. So the United States saw this aircraft, they went, okay, cool, great, we've found something better, also made by the same company. And you know what? We don't actually need this aircraft in service anymore. So we are going to move on to bigger and better things, but we also really love money. Turns out capitalism is running strong here, and we can sell these. So we're going to sell a lot of them. In fact, we sold so many of them that the Brits even had a potential of adopting the aircraft before testing it against a Spitfire Mark I. And in the comparison between the two, the Hawk had a better visibility ratio out the cockpit and was better at diving than the Spitfire was due to a slightly less touchy elevator. But unfortunately for the Hawk's usage, the Spitfire's acceleration and top speed ultimately gave it the advantage because it could jump into combat and then decide to leave combat without huge negative repercussions for those actions. So what it sounds like so far is the P-36 Hawk is basically a failure as far as the United States is concerned and as far as our allies are concerned. That is where it gets interesting because it's not our allies that used it the longest. No, see, even before production had begun for this aircraft, the French had been in discussion with Curtiss about delivery of approximately 300 of these aircraft to them. They saw the potential in these aircraft and they went, hey, we want in. Took us a little while to deliver these aircraft. Not gonna lie, we were a little slow. But we did finally deliver them. Unfortunately, shortly after the delivery of these aircraft, the French got overrun by the German army. There's a very famous defeat on the Maginot Line where the Germans simply saw a whole bunch of entrenched French and went, what if we ran around the side? And then the French went, oh no, we didn't see them coming from the side. Oh no, we have really nice white flags. That being said, before they started waving the white flags, they did manage to shoot down 230 aircraft of a total of 1,009 during this time period before they actually lost the planes. So that means that the H-75, which is the P-36, actually made up for almost a third of the air-to-air kills during the 1940 Battle for France, while making up only 12.6% of the French Air Force's single-seater fighter force. In fact, they were actually so successful that of the 11 French aces in the early part of the war, 7 of them flew this P-36. Now, French aside, When the Germans actually did manage to do that little go around the side and smack them in the butt move, they ended up with a bunch of these captured P-36s, and given that all of their pilots were flying BF-109s at the time, they decided they really did not want to re-educate their pilots on an American plane using American ammunition and generally have to read American English. So, instead, being the absolutely money-hungry country that they were at the time, they decided to sell these captured P-36s. So, no money to make them, but hey, we can sell them. Finland decided that, you know what? The P-36 looks good enough for us. We're very happy to have that, and yes, please sell us as many as you can. Germany, over 3 deliveries, ended up selling 44 of this captured aircraft to the Finnish forces, which resulted in American planes fighting Allied fighters. The Finnish air forces became so enamored with this vehicle, calling it Susu, or Sweetheart, they ended up with 190 1/3 kills by 58 separate pilots in a 3-year period. Now, this is the part where I'm going to complain a little bit because, as it turns out, the Finnish are really bad at keeping records. I have spent over 2 weeks trying to find information on Finnish aces, specifically one, Kalevi Turvo. He's got between 14 1/4 and 15 3/4 victories in this aircraft. He's got more in a BF-109. He ended up dying during World War II. Very cool idea, very cool person. The stories that I'm sure he probably had would have been great to tell. Unfortunately, the Finnish decided that the numbers next to his name were the only interesting thing about the guy. As it turns out, the Italians have better records of Finnish aces than the Finnish do. But I translate the Finnish websites into English, only to find out that they are useless to me because they are saying the same things that the last website said, which is exactly 3 numbers and a name. And then, congratulations, moving on to the next topic, apparently. So, the Italians had just a touch more information on the guy. At the end of the day, unfortunately, there is just not enough information about this guy to really say much. Highly successful. I mean, he put the P-36 to work and really did a good job. Of course, he was Axis, and, whoa, we're celebrating the Axis powers. But, at the end of the day, they did a fantastic job of doing what they believed was the right thing. At the very least, we should know their stories. So here's what we do know. He was originally assigned to a Brewster Buffalo fighter, which is another aircraft that was manufactured by the United States. He was then briefly assigned to the Curtiss H-75, i.e., our favorite, the P-36, and then was promoted to lieutenant on the 8th of October 1942 after shooting down several more Russian planes. Eventually, on the 12th of February 1943, he was assigned to a unit using the Messerschmitt Bf-109, and using the German fighter, he achieved another 7 victories. He was shot down on the 20th of August 1943 and disappeared. His body was never recovered. During his flight record, he won 3 honors. One is the Cross of Liberty 3rd class, the second is the Cross of Liberty 4th class, and the third is the Continuation War Commemorative Medal. Once again, I am greatly disappointed by the lack of documentation on this individual person. I wish we had really any information about him, but unfortunately, pretty much everything I've found has been dates, times, how many he shot down, and that's about it. But don't you worry, there is another. Kyösti Karhila. Kyösti spent his late childhood building gliders through a program that made the trainees sign a contract to perform mandatory military service in the Air Force. Finland and Russia then began some hostilities. They began the war known as the Winter War. This war would go on to produce somebody known as the White Death, who was a very good sniper on the Finnish side, who used no scope. In any case, Gilsty was drafted just after the beginning of the war, and in fact was drafted so quickly because of his contract that he was starting his military service just 7 days after the war broke out. Now, while most of the trainees, 84 in total, had some sort of flight experience, they started from the very beginning with their training, which was good because that way nobody misses anything if everybody learns the same thing. Since the Winter War was only 105 days long, their training concluded after the war had ended. But before the war ended, on the 30th of March, he and 35 other trainees were selected for a secret mission to sneak into Great Britain for more training, and then ferry Hawker Hurricanes back to Finland to continue on in the war. The armistice was signed on the 13th of March, and the mission was canceled. So, once that mission was canceled, they were given the option to select what type of training they were going to receive, whether they were going to go into bombers, fighters, or reconnaissance aircraft. Gilsty decided to go with fighters. This led to training on a frozen lake where they would take off and land up until the ice began to melt. He did very well, getting 96% of his hits on ground targets and 40% in the air target section. This success led to him getting the opportunity to complete reserve officer training. Well, not Air Force reserve officer training, because Finland didn't have an Air Force officer training course. So, instead, all of the reserve officers for the Air Force were sent to infantry officer training, which meant that they then had to go learn a bunch of skills which they probably would not end up using in any wartime situation, but at the very basic level, they got a little more fit, they got to do some combat skiing, they learned how to give commands, and at the end of the day, they were better for it. So, once training was completed, he ended up getting a bunch more flying hours, but actually did not end up earning his pilot's wings before his 18 months of compulsory service were fulfilled on the 4th of June 1941, so he was sent home. And then, on the 19th of June 1941, he was called back into service, where he once again resumed flying and ended up earning his pilot's wings. Being posted as a wingman for his senior officer, Major Ehrenruth, he was assigned to a Fokker aircraft initially, but shortly after being posted, the reconnaissance squadrons nearby were told, "You don't need those P-36s anymore. We're taking those, you can have the Fokkers, we're actually doing something with our planes." And so they switched them out. This would lead to his first air-to-air battle. On the 31st of July, he and Major Ehrenruth took off on a flight. Ehrenruth wanted to do some sightseeing, and he volunteered for the role of wingman. Shortly after taking off and crossing the front line, the major started heading towards an airbase that was currently in enemy hands. Heavy AA began firing at them, and then the major's oil temperatures started going up, which was a very common problem with the P-36s that were running the Cyclone engine, and he had to decrease power. Gilsty was curious as to why his major had decided to fly slower while being shot at, but in any case, he was the wingman, so he paid attention to the horizon and spotted 2 dots behind them. Since they had no radios, he pushed the power lever, flew up on the major's wing, and signaled for the major to follow him. He then flipped around and started heading head-on towards 2 I-53s. The I-53s started at a higher altitude and were diving slightly down towards Gilsty, and in this case, both the Russians and Gilsty decided to go into a full head-on. Everybody fires, and of course, this is where you get to play chicken. The Russians decided not to dodge, and Gilsty had to dodge and then come back around for a second pass. The Russians followed, and both ended up shooting at each other a good deal. Now, the I-53 is a very maneuverable plane, and unfortunately, it has the advantage in a turn fight versus a P-36. So, since he was at about 2,000 meters, Kiosti decided to dive, because the Russian plane does not dive like a P-36. The Russian tried to follow, and it even fired some shots, but he was left behind. At this point, Kiosti turned to find his leader. The Major had engaged the second I-53 and had shot it down thanks to his experience. When Kiosti rejoined on him, he began to think, "This is serious. I have abandoned my leader in the face of the enemy." Upon landing, the Major got out, slapped him on both shoulders, and said, "That's the way. You saved us both." The Major had no idea about the Russians' existence and continued to praise Kiosti throughout the day. Interestingly enough, in an interview conducted in 1998, Kiosti would state that whenever he was shooting as a pilot in battle, he only ever fired at aircraft. What happened to the pilot was another matter, but he never felt blind hate towards the Russians, even though his slogan was, "Dead Russian is the best Russian." He also stated, "My actions were considerate, not blind rage." It would be several months later in October of 1941 where Kiosti would get his first successful victory against a Russian plane known as the I-16. After head-on firing again, both turned for another head-on pass. After that, Kiosti managed to get on the tail, and the I-16 decided to dive vertically. He followed. He finally got the chance to shoot, and in the same moment, realized that they were about to fly just straight into the ground. He pulled the stick as hard as he could and ended up blacking out, but some of his tracers did hit, and he did not see that plane flying again. It was quite a ways later when the troops ended up occupying that territory that they found the plane that he had shot down. After the war, Kiosti would go on to fly airliners. He gathered 556 flying hours during the war and 24,000 after the war. He ended up dying in Helsinki at the age of 88 as the last Finnish fighter ace. F-18 Hornets of the Finnish Air Force performed flybys over the city during his funeral. So, thank you for joining me as we talk about this aircraft that, while it didn't have the biggest American influence in the war, did actually have a very interesting track record. At the end of the day, go learn stories from people that are interesting. People don't always write down the things that they've done, but somebody should, because history is important, and if you're not paying attention to history, you're doomed to repeat it. So, learn everything you can. Ask your grandpa if he's got any cool stories. Ask your dad if he's got any cool stories. Write them down. Record them somehow. History is fantastic, and we need to pay more attention to it. In any case, thank you for joining me. That's Demonic Maelstrom, signing off.